The Escape of Oney Judge, Martha Washington's Slave Finds Freedom by Arnold McCully. This book is for Evelyn Gearson's children, Noah and Zelia. Oney, come here, child. It was Mrs. Washington. Oney ran to her and curtsied, as the house slaves did. Had the mistress caught her doing something wrong? Oney, I've had my eye on you, the great lady said. I see a bright girl who can learn. Tomorrow you will take up a needle and sew alongside your mother in the mansion. Oh, thank you, ma'am, Oney cried. I'll be glad to work with Mama. Oney knew that one reason she had been picked to work in the big house at Mount Vernon was because her father was a white servant and she was light-skinned. But she was bright, too, and loved learning new things. In no time, she mastered the tiny, even stitching Mrs. Washington's sewing circle was famous for. When the Revolutionary War ended, General Washington came home to Virginia, safe and sound, a hero. People were calling him the father of his country. He was the father of Mount Vernon, too, keeping a stern eye on all the work that had to be done. The general's valet boasted that his master had brought liberty to the United States. Oney asked him what it meant. Liberty means people are free, he said. But we're not, Oney said. Be careful what you say, he scolded. You're lucky to be in the mansion. Oney knew that. She had seen others working in the field, and she had seen the terrible welts on a runaway slave's back after he had been caught and brought back. But for Oney, an even worse punishment than whipping was to be sold to another owner who might work you to death, in a place where you'd never see your family again. Mrs. Washington was raising 2 grandchildren, a girl, Nellie, and a boy, Wash. Oney was Nellie's playmate when she wasn't sewing, but she was told to leave the room when Nellie's tutor came to teach her lessons. One day, Mrs. Washington said, Oney, you've become like another of our children. Oney bent her head to show thanks. Then she blurted out, Mrs. Washington, please, may I learn to read? Mrs. Washington laughed. No, child, you may not. There's no need for you to learn. Oney was crushed, but she hid the hurt. Instead of lessons, Mrs. Washington gave Oney a new task. She would learn to starch and pleat her mistress's fancy caps. The general has been elected president of the United States, she said. We're moving to the new capital up north. You will be my personal maid there. Exciting as it was, Oney hated to leave her mother and everything she knew behind. The new president traveled to New York City to be inaugurated. His family followed a few weeks later. Oney managed to keep Mrs. Washington's dresses, caps, fresh through the dust and heat, and cheering mobs at every roads, ferry crossing, revolutionary battleground, speech, and fireworks display. After a year and a half in New York, the government moved the capital to Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. Mrs. Washington received elegant lady callers, returned their visits, and shopped for some of the goods the bustling port offered. She fingered gorgeous fabrics from England and France at a dry goods store. Oney studied ladies' gowns to see how they were cut and sewn. Mrs. Washington said that she and the president must not be too fancy, lest they be accused of putting on royal airs in a republic. But her caps became more and more elaborate. Only Oney could fashion them just right. Nellie liked to sit in the window and watch people walking in the street. Oney sometimes sat with her and marveled at the many black people hurrying by, their heads held high. Where could they be going so proudly? Then Oney was sent to run errands all by herself. The world suddenly seemed new. Without her mistress watching her every move, Oney felt proud too. When Mrs. Washington went to visit important ladies, Oney sat with her servants in the back kitchens. She learned that many former slaves had settled in Philadelphia. Oney tried to imagine being free, but she could not. She worked as hard as a free black, but she wasn't paid. She depended on the Washingtons for food, for warmth, for clothing, for her bed, and they said she was just like a child to them. How do slaves get free? She asked one servant. Some bought their freedom and moved here. Others ran away or were freed by their masters, she told her. And there's a law in Pennsylvania that an adult slave who lives here 6 months must be freed. Now Oney understood why the Washingtons had started sending some of their slaves back for visits to Mount Vernon. The president was reelected for a second term in 1792. He and Mrs. Washington would have to live at their beloved Mount Vernon for 4 more years. Oney was in the kitchen in the president's house in Philadelphia one day in the summer of 1793 when a delivery man burst excitedly through the door. "A ship has come from Haiti loaded with refugees. Toussaint is leading a revolt of the slaves, and white masters are fleeing for their lives. They call Toussaint the George Washington of Haiti." Oney listened with wonder. Like George Washington? But this was the black people liberating themselves. "That island is a tiny place," the man went on. "In this big country, we blacks must gain our freedom one by one. The Creator never meant for us to be in chains." The Creator never meant for us to be in chains. That phrase ran over and over in Oney's mind. It had to be true. She was not a child of the Washingtons. She was one of God's children, just as they were. But could she ever buy her freedom? Every year on President Washington's birthday, she was given $1. Last year, she used part of it to buy some ribbon and to send to her mother. What if she saved the money instead? How many years before she had enough to be free? She asked Hercules, the Washington's cook. He laughed and said, "Some say the master plans to free his slaves when he dies." Then he thought for a moment, "But you belong to Mrs. Washington, and I've never heard she has plans to free anyone." Nellie was begging to go to dancing lessons with her friend Betsy, the daughter of Senator John Langdon from New Hampshire. Mrs. Washington finally agreed to let her go. Oney sewed a new dress for Nellie. "How beautiful!" Betsy's mother cried. "What fine stitching! Who is your dressmaker?" "My girl Oney made it," said Mrs. Washington. "Oh, wouldn't you let me borrow her?" asked Mrs. Langdon. "She could earn a little pocket money." "Oh, dear, no," said Mrs. Washington. "I couldn't spare Oney." Mrs. Washington sometimes allowed Oney to attend the theater with Hercules. They sat with Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who had bought their freedom and now worked with the Quakers, helping runaway slaves to go further. The Quakers had even petitioned the government to abolish slavery. Oney had heard the president grumble about the trouble their demands caused him. One night at bedtime, Mrs. Washington said, "Child, my granddaughter Eliza Custis is getting married. I have decided that after I die, you shall go and live with her and her husband in Virginia." Oney stifled a cry. Would she be owned by Eliza, who treated her badly whenever she came? And owned by Eliza's husband, who could do whatever he liked with her? Sure enough, a few weeks later, Hercules whispered to her, "That husband of Miss Eliza's sister has already started selling some of her slaves." If one Custis' husband was selling his slaves, so would Miss Eliza's husband. Oney thought she could stand anything but being sold. The Washingtons were about to go back to Mount Vernon for a vacation. Everyone was packing, and she could too, without arousing suspicion. Oney decided that she must seize the moment now. When Mrs. Washington sent her to deliver a message, she went to see the Joneses. She threw herself on their mercy. "I must run now." "We will help you," they promised. The day before the departure from Mount Vernon, Oney packed a bag and took it to the back door, where it was picked up by a boy Mrs. Jones had sent. Oney waited for the Washingtons to sit down to dinner, and as they did every day precisely at 4 o'clock. Then she crept down the back alley and walked quickly to where the Joneses lived. While Oney hid there, Mr. Jones searched for ship's captains willing to take a runaway slave aboard. It didn't matter where the ship was going so long as it carried it far away from the Washingtons. Finally, the captain of the Nancy consented. After a voyage of 5 days, Oney landed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. A free black family took her in, and she told them she would earn her keep by sewing. No one knew her there. Her life was her own. But one day, a few weeks later, as she walked along the main street, a voice called out, "Why, Oney, whatever are you doing here? And where is Mrs. Washington?" It was Betsy Langdon, Nellie's friend, home for vacation. Horrified, Oney turned and ran. Betsy would tell the Washingtons she had seen her. Slave catchers would be set on her trail. Oney stayed indoors, doing her sewing and waiting with dread for what might happen next. That turned out to be an unexpected offer of employment from Mr. Joseph Whipple, the customs agent. Oney went to see him, expecting to be asked what skills she possessed. Instead, he began by asking who had given her the idea of running away. Oney was alarmed that he knew who she was, but she answered honestly, "It was my own idea. I would rather die than be given away or sold." "Didn't the president and his lady treat you kindly?" "They did, and I would return to them if they would free me when they die." "If you go back, they will be pleased, and I am sure they would do this for you. There is a boat that departs for the south tomorrow." Mr. Whipple stood barring the door, waiting for her decision. Oney studied his face. She missed her mother, but she had risked so much for freedom. She couldn't take the chance and let it slip away now. Bowing her head as she had in slavery, she said meekly, "All right, I will go home and pack my things." Mr. Whipple stepped aside and she hurried from his office. The family who had taken her in told her she had done the right thing to deceive Mr. Whipple. The president would have to go to court to force a fugitive slave to return. He won't do that. It would cause a scandal in the North. Stay here and wait him out. The ship sailed without Oney. Oney went on working, and as the weeks passed, she tried not to fret about the sword that hung over her new life. She learned to read, making real the dream she had held so long. Mr. Whipple had not given up. One day he came to Oney and said, "I told the president you would come back if he promised to free you one day. He says he won't bargain with a runaway slave. It wouldn't be fair to the slaves who remain in bondage. I know he would forgive you, but I can't force you to return." "I must stay here and make my own way," Oney replied quietly. Months passed, and she met a free black sailor named Jack Staines. They fell in love and married. A year later, Oney had a baby, and Jack Staines went back to sea. Meanwhile, there was a new president, and the Washingtons had taken up their old lives at Mount Vernon. Happy, except for the vexation of Oney's escape. Mrs. Washington continued to fume as the months wore on. Why, she kept asking, would a girl treated like a child of the family want to run away from it? When her nephew, Burwell Bassett, came to dinner and mentioned his forthcoming trip to Portsmouth, Mrs. Washington demanded, "Bring Oney back here with you." Oney was reading when Bassett knocked on her door. "Please, leave me alone," she said. Bassett tried to fool her. "I can promise you your freedom if you come back." "I am already free," Oney said. Bassett argued for a while and finally left. Oney allowed herself a sigh of relief. Perhaps it was really over. Bassett was staying with the Langdons. At dinner, he told another lie, that he had orders to force Oney to board a ship with her baby, who, by law, belonged to the Washingtons, too. John Langdon couldn't believe his ears. Hadn't Oney endured enough? Her baby was legally a slave and could be sold away from her? The senator excused himself from the table and went to the kitchen. There, he told a free black he had long employed to go to Oney and warn her to leave town with her baby in all haste. As soon as Oney heard these words, she wrapped up her baby, raced to a stable, and hired a wagon to take her to a family in another town. Several months later, President Washington died, and his wife gave up ever owning her maid again. For the rest of her long life, Oney Judge had no mistress but herself.